everyone, welcome to the August 30th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, happy to be back with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, who is returned from his vacation where he visited at least a couple of racetracks, Saratoga Springs and Charlestown. We'll talk about some of the races that Craig took in live on this podcast, but of course, the feature from this past weekend was the Grade 1 Travers, the Midsummer Derby, really the highlight of the Saratoga meet. We'll talk about that Travers Day card in depth, the undercard stakes as well, certainly delivered from a quality and excitement standpoint, so we'll mention all of those Grade 1 races on the Saturday card at Saratoga, including some others from other races during the week, other days during the week, I should say, including a couple of maiden races for the 2-year-olds that earned some nice speed figures on the Sunday card. We'll also mention some stakes racing for out in California at Del Mar, Charlestown, where they ran their Charlestown Classic card on Friday night, and then we'll wrap things up with a few other noteworthy speed figures from other venues like Parks, Monmouth, and even a race from Prairie Meadows that I know some people were interested in from last week. But Craig, welcome back to the podcast. I hope that your time off was enjoyable.
It was. I'm happy to be back. It's probably the longest break I've taken in a while, from a Friday through the next Sunday. So I think it was like 9 days or something like that. So I'm pretty refreshed. Got my share of racing in still while I was gone. I'm sure I'll tell a couple stories during the show here as we talk about some of these races. But yeah, it was a good time and ready to get back to work.
Yeah, definitely glad to have you back. We had some co-hosts fill in for the handicapping over the past week. They did an excellent job, but happy to touch base with you and do our recap show, which we did skip last week. I know you were up there for the Alabama, Craig, and you saw Nest's impressive performance. I didn't really cover that as a recap on the show, and we're not going to dive too much into that, but I know you were up in Saratoga for that race, and she certainly was impressive in that victory.
Yeah, she delivered as expected by most people. She didn't quite deliver speed figure wise, but I was impressed with and I say that her speed figure was fine. I think it was in the low 120. She had run a 130 last time, but visually it was good. She had a little bit of trouble. Maybe the little bit shorter distance contributed a little bit to that, but it was good, strong effort by her, but not quite as strong as the one we're going to talk about.
Yeah, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this most recent Saturday at Saratoga, which of course was Travers Day. And let's dive right into that future race, Craig. The Grade 1 Travers, won by the favorite heading in, Epicenter, who finally got that first Grade 1 victory, and I think can rightfully now be called the leader of the 3-year-old division after having registered this resounding score over a pretty nice field. And he certainly got a speed figure to boot that really is of the quality of a horse that's leading the division.
He ran a 129, which is his best so far by far, and he did it, just did everything perfectly. He was able to stay up close to what was a really solid pace. None of the fractions are coded in red, but all the pace figures were in the 130. He made a big move to take the lead by the 1 mile mark, and just drew away from there. It was about as dominant a performance as I can remember in the Travers since probably Arrogant. He just drew away with ease and never really looked like a loser at any time in the race.
Yeah, he had kind of hinted at the fact that he might have taken a step forward in the Jim Dandy. Kind of tough to know based on the way they rode him that race, kind of very conservatively early and just really asked him for anything at the top of the stretch before he coasted into the wire. It felt like he had taken a step forward since his Triple Crown races, and he confirmed that in this Travers by just dominating this field every step of the way. He really never looked like a loser at any point in the race. He was just traveling so sweetly in behind the leaders. It wasn't a big surprise to me to see him a little bit closer to the pace than he had been in a few of his prior starts. I know the connections didn't want to give him the chance to have traffic trouble. They put him up close to the pace, and once he got into the clear coming around the far turn, you could just tell that this was going to be a pretty dominant victory, and that's how it turned out as he drew off to win this race by over 5 lengths. As you said, the 129 TimeformUS speed figure definitely, I think the best that we've seen from a 3-year-old this year, Craig. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that is the case. And it seems like he's heading into the fall with a real chance to make an impact in a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic, of course, which remains to be seen how a few of the top older horses are going to handle that 10 furlong distance, namely Life is Good and Flightline, who we could imagine are pointing to that race. But Epicenter has thrown his hat into the ring as a 3-year-old that could make some noise in the latter portion of the year.
Yeah, I believe that is the highest figure, except for Nest, who's a filly, of course. I think she ran that 130. But yeah, it's right there with all the rest of them. And he's just been a model of consistency. He's never been out of the exacta since, I believe, his debut, where he didn't run very well. But since then, he's always been first or second. But this was a big step forward. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. We still have Life is Good and Flightline, who are going to face some tests. Before the Breeders' Cup Classic, Flightline at 10 furlongs. I'm not sure about Life is Good. But so it should be interesting to see how he can stack up. But at this point, I wouldn't bet against him because he certainly handled the 10 furlongs just fine. I did want to mention a couple of the others. I thought Cyberknife proved that his Haskell was no fluke. He ran a 124 speed figure, a 1 point improvement over that Haskell win. He was extremely game. I was actually at one of my aunt's house visiting family, so I was kind of watching on the phone out of one eye, and I had played an exacta box with Epicenter and Cyberknife, and no kidding. At the eighth pole, I said, well, it was a good run, but he's done. And I turned it off, not trying to be overly rude. And several hours later, I was quite shocked to turn it back on and see that I had actually cashed that bet. And I don't want to red board. I mean, it was an $18 exacta. Who cares, right? But it was just one of those. I went back and watched the replay, and he was incredibly game to get second. A good hard ride by Florent Giroux to stay with it, and maybe a little bit of hang by the horses that ran third and fourth, Sandon and Rich Strike.
Yeah, well, we've seen Zandon hang a little bit in the past. That appeared to be the case in the Kentucky Derby. He had every chance to go by, and I think Zandon's proven at this point that 1.25 miles is probably a little bit far for him. He ran fine to be third in this race, but didn't really take that step forward you would have hoped to see out of the Triple Crown races. I agree, game effort from Cyberknife. It seems like he's really turned the corner since that poor effort in the Kentucky Derby. Ran so well on that Haskell. Maybe to some, the surprising pace setter of this race. That wasn't really a big shock to me because I know that the intention going in was not to send early voting to the lead. I think a lot of people expected him to be in front, but the connections have made it pretty clear they don't think he's best on the lead and they wanted him off the pace. So that kind of left Cyberknife in the driver's seat from his rail post position, and I thought Florent Giroux did the right thing to kind of seize the bull by the horns and go to the front end. He was simply second best to Epicenter on the day. And Craig, we should mention the Kentucky Derby winner, Rich Strike. Nothing to sneeze at with this performance here. I mean, he validated his Kentucky Derby. Epicenter has just taken a step forward since then and probably was a better horse all along.
For sure. Rich Strike had the perfect setup in the Derby. Got that great ride by Sonny Leone that's been well documented. He ran a 119 when he won the Derby. He ran a 121 here. So he's a pretty good horse. He's not the crazy long shot that will. Who knows if he'll ever win another race? I guess it kind of depends on where they campaign him. If he dropped in class, I'm sure he'd probably win a couple. If he keeps running against the best of the best, maybe not, unless he gets those circumstances. But he's got talent, no doubt about that. Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of early speed. He's going to be a victim of the pace, but he's not a fluke Derby winner. I've definitely seen worse in my time watching horse racing, worst Kentucky Derby winners. As for early voting, I agree. I hadn't heard what the connection said, but I just had a feeling they were going to take him off the pace. When you look, he won the Preakness a little bit off the pace, and he lost the Wood and the Jim Dandy on the pace. So they let the results dictate it. At the end of the day, I don't think it mattered because he had no run whatsoever. I don't know if something went wrong with him, or if he was just eased when they realized he couldn't win. But that wasn't the early voting we saw this year, and I don't think it had anything to do with where he was placed early.
Yeah, he's a horse that I would imagine might be considered for retirement at this point. It just seems like something's gone amiss with him since the Preakness, and he's got such a pedigree. You'd imagine he's got stud value that they wouldn't want to tarnish at this point. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap up Rich Strike, something was made of the fact that he can get up for second in this race, that maybe he hung a little bit too. But I thought he actually put in a game effort, because there was a point on the far turn where he came off the bridle earlier than everybody else, and it looked for a brief second like Rich Strike was going to go backwards, and Sonny Leone, basically passing the half-mile pole, really got into him and put him under a hard drive. And the fact that this horse kept trying, despite being hard-ridden for basically the last half mile of the race, just speaks to the fact that he's a horse that really does, have a lot of determination, and we saw that in the Kentucky Derby, and I think we saw some of that again here. And he's going to win another solid race. I don't know if races like the Breeders' Cup Classic are really realistic goals for him, but he's not a bad horse, and he'll do well from here. But nobody was any match for Epicenter, and very excited to see how he stacks up against the older horses later in the year. Let's move on to some of the other Grade 1 action on the Travers Day undercard. The race run right before the Travers was the Sword Dancer, going 1.5 miles, Craig. And Gufo, despite having a bit of a disappointing year up until this point, was able to repeat winning the Sword Dancer for the second year in a row. Definitely got some help up front from the pace. Maybe the blinkers going back on also gave him some added focus, but the real Gufo showed up in this race.
He was very good. He ran a 125, which almost matched his speed figure early in the year when he won the Grade 2 Pan American in his first start. It did match. He ran a 124 that day, so just a point off. And yeah, he's kind of a weird horse in that he doesn't always show up, doesn't always run his best. Maybe the 1.5 miles has something to do with it. It seems to be his preferred distance to some point. Most of his big wins have come at that. Maybe that extra furlong helps a little more than we realize. But he's a good one. I just still don't know what to make of this turf division here in the U.S. It seems like they just keep taking turns. Mirror Mission ran well. He was one that we saw over that course at Churchill that was hard to trust, but he kind of flattered Santine a little bit, I would say, and it's still just a division that is completely wide open to my eye.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the results in these marathon turf races, or races on the turf going 10 furlongs or longer, are so dependent on the trips and who shows up on the day. As you said, a lot of horses taking turns beating each other. I do want to give a lot of credit to Mira Mission, Craig, because this was a pretty hot pace up front. Tribhuvan took no prisoners on the front end. He set some enterprising fractions on the lead, and he certainly paid the price. He was just totally gassed by the time they got to the quarter pole. But Mira Mission was the one horse that was in attendance to that pace. He was only about 3 lengths off it the entire way. Made the first move to take over an upper stretch, and briefly looked like he might win the race. I know he was the pick of Darren Zacali, who I had on the podcast last week, and I thought he had a really good opinion on it about the 8th pole, but he just kind of got too tired in the last furlong as Gufo swallowed him up. But this was Mira Mission's first try at a marathon distance, and I thought he ran very admirably, considering that the other 4 horses that were in the Superfecta all closed from 7th, 8th, and 10th, the back of the pack. So Mira Mission arguably ran the best race.
I agree. He'd be the one I wanted if they were to match up in a couple weeks. Who knows if they will? But he ran very well. It was a great pick by Darren. So sometimes when you bet long shots, you're going to run second like that, even when they show up. But good, strong effort by him, and he's one that I definitely want to keep an eye on. And I want to mention Julian Leperoux too, because he's a guy that gets some grief over the years from what I've seen, and he's actually been riding really well at this Saratoga meet, and this was one of the highlights, I would say.
Broome was the disappointment of this race, got bet down to 3-2 favoritism, and I think we saw him fall victim to something that a lot of Europeans are vulnerable to, and that's the start. In the US, it's a lot more important to break sharply, because with these tight turns on the turf courses, it's hard to regain the position that you lose at the start, and he's not a horse that wants to come from that far back, and he just broke about a leg slowly, and the race was kind of dictated to him from there. He ran okay to get up for 4th, but I think that's always the danger when you support these Euros at short prices, Craig, is they don't have that gate speed.
Right, and that matters even at a 1.5 miles. You can't just come walking out of the gate or not break well. You just give up too much position, and I think that's what happened here. And he's a horse who's had trouble at other times as well, even over in Europe. So something to keep an eye on. I doubt we've seen the last of Broom. He ran second in the Breeders' Cup Turf, so at the very least, I would think we would probably see him again in that race if he's able to get in. So just something to think about with him. The other horse I did want to mention was Tripuven. I know we've talked about him a lot. I know we both have had some success with him at pretty big prices a couple of times, but we've both mentioned it before. This is just too far for him. He's more, I think, a mile and a quarter is probably his sweet spot. When you get out to a mile and a half, you're going to get a solid pace, but it's just too much.
The race right before the Sword Dancer was yet another Grade 1 event, the Personal Ensign. Just a field of 5 in this one, Craig, but all the right fillies and mares were assembled here. Basically a rematch of the Ogden Phipps from Belmont Stakes Day, and a slightly different result this time as Malathot got the victory here, going one better than her second place finish in the Phipps. Again, though, running down search results, kind of a rematch, actually, of the Kentucky Oaks back in 2021 when search results ran that big race, but just could not fend off Malathot in the late stages. And similar circumstance here. Looked like search results might have gotten enough of a head start on her at the top of the stretch, but when Malathot's got her mind on running, she just runs down that target.
Malathot loves being involved in those close finishes, and yet another one for her. She was able to get the job done this time. Game effort from her. It got a 120 speed figure, so not the best she's run in her career, but it was also a race that I think was probably hampered speed figure-wise a little bit by what was a pretty tepid pace. The early pace figures were just in the teens, 114 early, so that's always going to hold your speed figure back a little bit. That doesn't bode well for the horse who was the second choice in here, Latruska, who set a pretty easy pace, was clear early, clear most of the way for the first 6 furlongs, and just had nothing left for the stretch. She is a 6-year-old, and I just wonder if we're ever going to see the same Latruska we did before. And the disappointment had to be Clairiere, but I do think she had an excuse with the trouble she had at the gate.
Yeah, Latruska's a funny one. I think that she ran better here. I mean, considering that throughout her career, she's kind of been this all or nothing type. She's not really the type to finish second or third in her races. She either wins and holds you off or she's nowhere. And I thought that she actually tried in this race. She only lost by 2.5 lengths on the wire. It just felt like maybe this year the division's gotten significantly tougher. And some of those races that Latruska did win last year, beating horses like Bonnie South, Dunbar Road, it just feels like the division's gotten deeper now that some of those talented 3-year-olds from last year have turned for the Malathots, the search results, the Clairieres. They're making this filly and mare division a lot tougher than the one that Latruska dominated last year. And I guess her speed figures have dropped off a little bit, but it just feels like this was a tougher Personal Ensign than the one that she won last year, as impressive as she was that day. So I don't want to be too down on Latruska. I just feel like she's in some deeper waters now. Tough luck for search results, Craig. I mean, she has been in great form, really for the entire year, going back to the Kentucky Oaks last year, but just can't quite get it done in some of these big races, and a really frustrating beat for her. As you said, the disappointment was Clairiere, just not herself on this day. I know there's reporting that she came out of this race with some cuts on her tongue that have been attributed to her acting up in the starting gate prior to the race, and for whatever reason, you could tell just a few strides out of the starting gate, she did not have her mind on running here, dropped way back, was not the choice of Joel Rosario. I mean, she just was not her typical aggressive self, not even the same horse that we had seen in the Chuvy in her prior race, just one that you probably want to draw a line through moving forward for her.
That was what I was going to say. Yeah, I'm just completely putting a line through that one. If Steve Asmussen brings her back in a big race, I'm going to just ignore that one and expect her to run well. As for search results, I agree. She was in a tough spot. She was kind of in that chase position. The last time she challenged Latruska, she won the battle but lost the war. This time, Flavien Prat tried to time the ride a little bit better, and I think he did. He was able to open up with a furlong to go. He was a length on top. Just couldn't hold off Malathot once again. She's a very good filly, and no shame in losing to her. It's just one of those where her style in the same race with Latruska, I think, is always going to make it a little tough for her. It'll be interesting to see how she does if she gets away from that foe.
Well, Craig, there were a couple of Grade 1 events going the 7 furlong distance a little bit earlier in the day at Saratoga on Saturday that I know generated a lot of discussion, some comparison. Let's talk about the 3-year-old Grade 1 first, the H. Allen Jerkins Memorial, won by Jack Christopher, who is clearly the best 3-year-old sprinter out there, and only won this race by a length and a quarter, but he definitely is kind of cementing his position as one of the most talented 3-year-olds in this crop. Got the right kind of trip, sitting off the very quick Conacher, who did set some hot fractions up front, but Jack Christopher simply better than his foes in this race.
To my mind, he may be the best sprinter out there, at least of horses who are pointing the sprint. And he showed it here. He showed he can rate. He was able to sit comfortably off a Conacher. Pretty quick pace figures in the 130s. He just sat outside off his flank, took over when asked, and had plenty left to hold off the closers. Gunite's a top sprinter as well, and he really was never in danger. He ran a 128 speed figure. I'll mention the final time was a 126 because it was a little bit slower than the race we're going to talk about next, but it did get a little bit of a pace boost, so that's why it's going to get with a slightly higher figure. But very good effort from Jack Christopher to my eye, and one that I'm not sure what they're going to do with him. I really hope they point for the sprint and not the dirt mile, because I just think he would make that race a really good one.
I pretty much agree about the year-end target for him. I always love to see the sprinters cut back to the sprint rather than go 2 turns in the dirt mile. I just think that's a much more natural fit for most of these horses. I'm sure the connections are going to look at how each of those races are coming up and their respective pace scenarios. That's going to weigh a lot into that decision. But at the 7 furlong distance, Jack Christopher is pretty dominant. We'll see if he was able to negotiate that cut back to 6. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't, because he's not the kind of horse that needs to be on the lead. He's comfortable stalking. We saw that here, is he was never getting to rank, sitting a couple lengths off Conacher, and was able to reel that one in without too much trouble. Gunite with a really game performance to be second, Craig. I don't want to take anything away from that horse. He tried really hard and just seems like a horse that really does step up his game at Saratoga. That's where he's run some of his best races, but Jack Christopher once again had his number, and got to give a little shout out to the 3rd place finisher, Runnin' Son of a Gun, who was quite the claim for $40,000 back on New Year's Eve of last year by John Toscano and the Connections. They've had a lot of fun with this horse, and now a Grade 1 placing for this horse that they claimed out of a maiden claiming event.
Yeah, he's done very well. He was that horse we've talked about before, who was a way distant second to Charge It, but he ran a good 3rd in the Amsterdam at a huge price. Now ran a good 3rd in the Jerkins, and he actually ran a really good speed figure. His speed figure has gotten better every time since he has been claimed, all the way up to a 122 in this spot. So he is a running son of a gun, to be a little punny.
Let's also talk about the Grade 1 Forgo, run at the same distance as the Jerkin, 7 furlongs on the main track. And Craig, a lot of discussion about the pace of this race, the immediate aftermath of the race, kind of some gut reactions to Jackie's Warrior losing. I know that the prevailing opinion I saw on social media was that Jackie's Warrior had gotten involved in too much of a duel and was softened up for the late challenge of Cody's Wish. But when you look at the pace figures and compare it to the other 7 furlong races on the card, it's the opposite situation. Jackie's Warrior did not go that fast up front, and no doubt in my mind that Cody's Wish just ran the better race on the day.
He was the best horse. The pace was not quick. The pace figures were in the 120s. I don't want to make it out like it was a crawl, but for these horses, it was not that strong. Maybe the pressure had a little bit to do with it. If so, you wonder why maybe Jackie's Warrior didn't go a little faster, but who knows if that works or not, because maybe Irad Ortiz keeps pressing the pace with Pipeline. To my mind, Jackie's Warrior had no real excuse. He ran fine. He ran a 125 speed figure, but Cody's Wish ran a 126, and he did it with a tougher pace scenario to close into. And I don't think it's any big fluke that Cody's Wish was able to do this. He's been running big speed figures, at least on TimeformUS. I haven't looked at anyone else's, but his speed figures matched right up with what we've seen from Jackie's Warrior.
Yeah, I feel like Jackie's Warrior, I mean, he'd kind of gained this air of invincibility off that very visually impressive score in the Alfred G. Vanderbilt earlier in the meet. That was a much, much weaker field than the one that he met in the Forgo, and they really never had to ask him for anything that day. But this was a spot where he was going to have to run a little bit. I know that the public bet him down to 1-9. That, in retrospect, was probably a little ridiculous, just given the quality of this field, as you say. There were horses in here that were running some comparable speed figures coming into the race, and Cody's Wish, he just stepped up. I mean, he was done no favors on the front end, and it's not like anybody else was making a significant run from the back of the pack in this race. He's the only horse that made up that kind of ground into what was a pretty moderate pace. And I was looking up some of the Trackus data. Trackus had him coming home his final quarter in 23.3 seconds, which is just something you don't often see in races over a track like Saratoga, where kickback is such an issue, where speed is often so dangerous over that deep and tiring surface. I mean, he absolutely flew home down the center of the racetrack. Really impressive performance from Cody's Wish. And I know he's a horse that they had generally concentrated on 1 mile races prior to this, but he showed that he can go the 7 furlongs. He is the kind of horse I would imagine would be much more likely to go in a race like the Dirt Mile at year's end. I think he seems better suited to that. Jackie's Warrior, of course, would turn back to the sprint, and I would imagine that Steve Asmussen will be looking to have him cranked up for that race, and I think we're going to see him set a much faster pace the next time, and probably last time, that we see Jackie's Warrior in the Breeders' Cup.
It will be interesting to see how fast he goes. And as for Cody's Wish, I should mention he got a 126 that was knocked down a little bit by the pace from a 128 final time. But he's a horse who I don't know what I would do with him. I prefer, as a fan, to see him in the sprint. Because, for one thing, he's 0 for 2 at 2 turns. He hasn't tried it very often. He ran okay at Tampa when he tried it and was a close second, but he's been better around 1 turn, and he will almost assuredly get some pace in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. So I think he'd be a real factor in there, but I agree with you. I have a hunch that they're probably going to go the other direction, and that's a little disappointing to me personally. As for the others, I didn't think there was a whole lot to talk about. Pipeline ran fine in here. And after that, it was a pretty big gap back to Baby Yoda. So really, it was about the top 2.
Yeah, and we mentioned these 2 races in succession, and it would be pretty fascinating to see a horse like Jack Christopher match up against the older Jackie's Warrior in a race like the Breeders' Cup Sprint. I think that Jackie's Warrior would be a tougher pace foe to run down than a horse like Conacher, as talented as he is, and you just hope that by the time that fall rolls around, we're able to get those 2 in the starting gate for the same race, because that's what the Breeders' Cup is supposed to be about, seeing the champions run against each other, and you just hope that they both end up in the same race, assuming that they're both able to stay sound by that point in time. Let's talk about another race run at the 7 furlong distance that should not get lost in the shuffle from last week, and that was the Grade 1 Ballerina, typically run on the Travers Saturday card. This one for the fillies and mares, and it was won by Goodnight Olive, the Chad Brown trainee, who took a big step up in class, a big step up from a speed figure standpoint, Craig, and beat a really nice field in doing so.
This was an impressive effort, one I wasn't really expecting. I mean, I figured she would be a contender in this race. Figured 5-1 was about the right odds for her. It seemed fair based on her past performances, but she really exploded here for Irad Ortiz. She ran a 125 speed figure. She was able to track what was a pretty fast pace, even though we don't have it in red. That's because it was a fast race overall. The early pace figure set by the surprising travel column was a 142. So, and she was only just a few lengths behind that, and a length and a half, and just a really big effort from her. She's a horse who's been on a tear without really running fast. She was second in her debut. I think this was her 5th win in a row, but she really broke through and ran that big number, which was almost similar to what we saw in the Forgo. So, to my eye, she's probably the Breeders' Cup filly and mare sprint favorite right now based on this effort.
Yeah, it feels kind of crazy to say that for a filly that just made her stakes debut in this race, but that does seem like it should be the case. I mean, she beat almost all of the major players in that division in this spot and did so quite resoundingly. There were some disappointments in this race, Craig, namely CC, who went off as the 3-2 favorite. She just never looked like she was in the right position. I think breaking from the rail and eating all that dirt, it just didn't really agree with her. She didn't seem like herself in this race. And also Bella Sofia, who just kind of going along that trend of the Rudy Rodriguez bar not really showing up to play at this Saratoga meet. She has not looked like the same horse since even the springtime in both of these Saratoga starts, both the Honorable Miss and here. She just had nothing after contesting the pace. But it was a parade of Bill Mott runners in behind Goodnight Olive, and there are some nice horses like Caramel Swirl and Obligatory. And Goodnight Olive, I mean, she beat them so easily in the end. And this 125 TimeformUS speed figure that she got, that's clearly the best that we've seen in this division in a little while, probably since Gamine.
For sure. It dwarfs what we saw even in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf won by the or Turf Filly and Mare Sprint won by the aforementioned Cece when she won it last year with only like a 119. Some of the others, Caramel Swirl, she ran fine. She's a horse who's been in really good form. I backed that up here. Obligatory, not sure what to make of her. I haven't got a chance to watch the head on. She definitely had some trouble when she was making her run at the top of the stretch. It seemed like a horse, this Lady Rocket, just came out and slammed into her. Not sure really what happened there watching the pan. But if it didn't cost her the win for sure, maybe she'd have been closer for second and is worth giving another chance.
Yeah, there were some surprising tactics in this race, primarily from the connections of Lady Rocket, who just, you could tell coming right out of the gate, they wanted no part of the front end. I don't know why that was the plan, since she's done her best running towards the front before, but I think that took away any chance that she might have had. She didn't run her race anyway. But take nothing away from Goodnight Olive, because she showed up with an impressive performance here, and like you said, she's going to be a major force in this division moving forward if she continues to deliver efforts like this. Let's move on to one more race from that Saturday card on Travers Day as we wrap it up. The Grade 2 Ballston Spa run earlier in the day on the turf course for the fillies and mares. Not a whole lot to dissect here from a trip standpoint, Craig. Technical analysis, bet down to heavy favoritism, and she delivered a nice performance, but give credit to Fluffy Socks, who got up for second here. I thought that she took a good run at her, but just kind of does what Fluffy Socks does and didn't really have that extra oomph to go by at the end.
Yeah, this race was a bit of a snoozer, to be honest. I mean, you had five horses, three Chad Browns. Chad Brown runs first, second, with the heavy favorite winning. Technical analysis ran fine. She ran a 124 speed figure, which is pretty good one. It's about grade two worthy. Probably will win some grade ones in this country for females. She set a solid pace doing it, faced some pressure. So I thought she ran well, and not a whole lot to add about this one.
Yeah, if anything, it's just yet another performance that flatters in Italian a little bit. That impressive Diana winner. We've seen now Delica come back to win the Beverly D, albeit not the strongest grade one that we've ever seen. And now Technical Analysis to run another nice speed figure after she was second in the Diana. So very much looking forward to seeing where in Italian can show up next. Another turf stakes from the last week at Saratoga, I believe on the Thursday card, was the risk averse for the 3-year-old fillies. This one going a mile on the inner course, and another Chad Brown trained winner, but a much bigger price this time, Craig, as Gina Romantica paid $30 to win, making her turf debut. Not one that had a whole lot of pedigree, but she clearly loved the green stuff.
We've seen that story from Chad Brown before, haven't we? Where the horse doesn't look to have much pedigree. And unfortunately for me, I bet the 9 in this spot. And the looked like she was gonna really be close at the wire, and then the 7 unleashed from the pack kind of had some traffic trouble. Flavian Prat was able to get her out, and once she did, it was over. I mean, she wound up winning by a length and a quarter, and was just seemed like watching visually was moving about twice as fast as everyone else in the field. It was on a day that Flavian Prat had a really good day that day. I can't remember how many he won, but he won with some big prices and kind of just showed what a really top rider he is. And not that most people don't already know it, but I know he was getting some knocks early in the meet. He wasn't winning like he did in California, which shouldn't really be a surprise. I mean, it's much tougher competition, but I really like what I've seen from him. He showed that he belongs in the big leagues. and a big effort from the winner as well. I do want to point out, I originally, if you look in the Timeform US chart now, there's a speed figure of 116. But you were nice enough to point out something that I missed while I was on vacation, that this race was mistimed at the 3/4 pole. So we were actually giving Gina Romanek a little bit of a boost, speed figure boost, because of how fast it looked like she finished. But the 3/4 time was off almost 2 seconds slower than what it really was in the chart. So that'll be adjusted, and Gina Romanek is going to get a 112 speed figure, not a 160.
Yeah, just a race that looked like it featured a faster pace than that original final quarter would have suggested. It didn't seem like Gina Romantica came home in 22 flat, just given the race flow. And it was a race that was falling apart a little bit. So I think that horse that you were high on at 19-1, Craig, Faith in Humanity, the second place Chad Brown runner, actually ran pretty well, kind of making the first move into that pace. But Gina Romantica just able to run her down. This was a result that made me pretty happy, because I liked her getting on turf in this race off what I had seen in her lone turf work over the Oklahoma course earlier in the meet. It just seemed like she had really taken to it as a daughter of Into Mischief, who is a little bit of an underrated turf sire. The Into Mischiefs, they do handle the turf just fine, and she clearly took to it here. Let's wrap up Saratoga, Craig, by talking about a few of the non-stakes events. Actually, just a couple of maiden races, both from the Sunday card. One of them was a turf route won by the very impressive Phil Bauer-trained Kijera, as I believe how you say her name. This was the second start of her career, but she was coming out of a pretty fast and strong maiden event earlier in the meet, and she clearly benefited from that experience, because she took another step forward here.
She ran a good second behind Pink Hue, who is, I assume, the division leader based off of that fast early win. If not the leader, she's certainly one of them. But Zijira was a good second that day, and she really backed it up here. She was able to track what was a pretty quick pace and just draw off through the stretch in a way you don't often see in turf races. So I really liked what I saw from her. She ran a 106 speed figure, and I would imagine stakes races are next. And based on that one, she's one we'll probably see in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, she seems like a really talented filly, definitely stakes bound. She's got the pedigree to be a nice turf horse, as a half-sister to that turf stakes winner 40 Under, who's been a good horse for Mike Maker and some other connections. Actually very closely related to that one, because he's by Uncle Mo, she's by Uncle Mo's son Nyquist. So definitely a talented filly for trainer Phil Bauer, who has just had an amazing Saratoga meet, limited starters, but I believe this was his sixth win at the meet from, I think, just 11 or 12 starters. It's quite a stat at Saratoga for him, a trainer that does not win at a high rate for the rest of the year, but definitely has come to Saratoga to play over the last couple of seasons, and he's got a good one in Kijera. Later in the day on Sunday, we saw a dirt sprint 2-year-old filly maiden event won by a very impressive first-time starter, the Great Maybe for Cherie DeVoe. This one, an expensive daughter of Upstart, and boy, did she have a lot of speed, Craig, and just never stopped.
Yeah, and from the rail, no less. She was able to get out, which is not always a great place to be when you're a first-time starter, especially for a 2-year-old. But it didn't seem to faze her in the slightest. She just rocketed out of there, got good position, was able to pass the leader once she, you could always just see she was traveling really well. Just drew off from the field, wound up with a 102 speed figure, and another really good filly that we saw on Sunday, sent out by Cherie DeVoe. So it's another one. The way racing is these days, I would imagine she'll be in a stakes race next time.
Yeah, and this day did get a red color coding in the TimeformUS PPs on the dirt course, indicating a speed favoring track. I would take that with a grain of salt. I think there were just 4 dirt races in total on Sunday. It's really tough for the algorithm to get these right when there's such a small sample size of dirt races. And you don't want to put too much stock in races like this that are almost fully comprised of first-time starters. The Great Maybe obviously ran a big race. There were some runners in behind her, though, that I think have some talent, including some for low-profile connections that I knew were working well coming into the race. Maybe not all of them cranked up to win their debuts. The third place finisher, Quiescent, for Robert Roboto. I think he's got some good 2-year-olds this year, just something to pay attention to as we move on to Belmont. And Nurse Kringle Dances, who was fourth for Ian Wilkes, another barn that doesn't win first out that much. Soledad for Bill Mott. These are names of horses to keep an eye on, because I think this was a strong maiden race and we could see some runners do better out of here in the future. Let's move on to another venue, Craig. Del Mar this past weekend out in California. They ran a couple of graded stakes races worth discussing, and also a 2-year-old we'll discuss a little bit later on. That was impressive on Friday, but covering the stakes first, on Saturday, the feature was the Grade 2 Pat O'Brien, 7 furlong, same conditions as the Forgo run at Saratoga. Not as strong a field as that. They did send Speaker's Corner out west to contest that race, and he was sent off as the heavy favorite, but didn't really show up with his best effort, as instead it was the Bob Baffert-trained Laurel River who just continued the tear that he's on. Stepped up to stakes company out of allowance races, but showed that he's still capable of running big speed figures even against the big boys.
He did. He had run bigger speed figures than some of the horses that took more action than him, like American Theorem and not Speaker's Corner, obviously. But there were a couple others, Getter Number, I think, who had run decent speed figures. But he ran a pretty big one here as well. The real disappointment with Speaker's Corner, he was bet the way he probably should have been based on speed figures. Just for whatever reason, didn't like that course out west. He was able to get out front and really had nothing. He was pretty much done on the turn, so not sure what happened with him, but Laurel River's a runner, no doubt about it. He's going to get about a 121 speed figure for this effort. The pace was a little bit on the tepid side, so maybe that even held the speed figure back a little bit, but not sure which direction they're going to point with this one. He's one who's done okay around 2 turns as well. This one was at 7 furlong, so he's yet another one of those horses that is going to have a choice to make for the Breeders' Cup, but he's certainly got some talent.
Yeah, this was a tough one for me to assess, because when I first watched it, it felt like Laurel River had taken this huge step forward and maybe he was suddenly going to be this major force in the sprint division. On the other hand, as you said, Speaker's Corner just didn't show up with the kind of effort that we've grown accustomed to seeing from him, and when you get past Speaker's Corner, kind of take him out of the race, this dirt sprint division out in California has not been the strongest. I mean, not to knock American Theorem, who was second, but I don't think anybody's considering him to be among the best sprinters in the country. So it was kind of ripe for a new face to strut his stuff if they were capable of doing so, and Laurel River certainly was. I think it still remains to be seen where he fits against some of those horses that were running on the East Coast this past weekend.
Yeah, and shout out to my guy, Senor Buscador, who we didn't see for a long time after he tried, I think it was a Lecomte, but he won the Springboard Mile here at Remington Park, and took a while to get back to the races, but good to see him get a third in a big Grade 2 like this. I'm just a personal fan of his, so good work by trainer Todd Fincher with him.
Well, speaking of trainer Todd Fincher, he had another pretty good one on Sunday's card at Del Mar, though lost a pretty frustrating half-length decision here with Slammed, who was one of a couple of 4 to 5 shots in the Grade 3 Rancho Bernardo. Looked like she was going to hold on for a second there in mid-stretch, Craig, but she and Edgeway, they hooked up from a long way out and just basically handled it like it was a match race all the way down the stretch. Edgeway just able to get the upper hand in the shadow of the wire.
Yeah, after about the first quarter mile, it was a match race for the last 4.5 furlongs, basically. And Edgeway was just able to outgame Slam to the wire. Good effort from both of them. Not anything too crazy speed figure wise. I would guess they're both going to get around a 116. So hard to compare them to a horse like Goodnight Olive, but they'd be right there with the rest of them that we've seen in the division in behind. So Edgeway always has speed, always seems to show up. And as you said, a good effort by Slammed, who's done pretty well taking advantage of that ship and win thing at Del Mar.
Yeah, she's the kind of a star of the Southwest racing, Sunland Park and Zia Park, and she's really stepped up her game since coming to Del Mar this summer. She is the older half-sister to Smash Ticket, who I think we're going to see in the Prioress at Saratoga this week, so excited to see that one. I think that race is on Friday, I want to say, maybe Saturday. I've got to look that up again. But Todd Fincher's got a pretty good one in the progeny of this damn Hennessy Smash. He really throws some very fast foals. Let's move on to a maiden race that was run at Del Mar on Friday. Actually, a maiden race around 2 turns. They've now started running those for the 2-year-olds, and the Bob Baffert-trained Carmel Road definitely handled the stretch out in distance better than some others, despite the fact that the early pace was on the quick side. This one just had a lot more stamina than the rest down to the wire.
He was a horse that disappointed a little first time going off 4 to 5, but at only 5 furlongs. He did seem like a horse when you watch that race who probably wanted more distance, being out of Quality Road, an unbridled song mare. And he showed it here. He ran really well, certainly improved his speed figure from a 92 all the way up to a 102. And that's actually a pretty good number around 2 turns this early. I don't want to really compare it to some of the sprint numbers we've seen, because especially at this point in these horses' development, that's 2 completely different ball games. So this is one that obviously has some upside.
Yeah, I never know what to make of these 1-mile races at Del Mar. Those opening fractions, the first quarter, sometimes come up unbelievably fast. I think there is you'll tell me, but I think there is a big run-up going that distance, which sometimes messes with those fractions. But Carmel Road definitely was going quickly up front, and the others kind of came off the bridle on the far turn, and he was the only one that kept on to the wire. Kind of funny that he's got this much stamina, because his dam, Inspired, even though she's by Unbridled Sog, she was a turf sprinter who really didn't want to go much farther than 5.5 furlongs. So interesting that Carmel Road really improved so much on the stretch out. But he's one of the first of a few Bob Baffert runners that I think we'll see making some noise heading into the fall.
Yeah, it is definitely a really long run up. I want to say in the 200-foot neighborhood. I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, I've seen some people talking about all the sub 21 quarters and such. And they switched to Gmax timing at Del Mar, but they do use portable beam times. So I'm pretty sure the races are accurate. It's just a product of that run up. And, maybe the course was remeasured a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what's happening out there. But when I've checked the races to make sure those 21, and they're almost 22s nearly every time, they've all been legit. So I don't worry about the timing. And, of course, that's built into the figures. If horses are always running around 22 flat, it's not going to be as fast as it looks to the naked eye.
Well, Craig, let's go back to Friday night and talk about some races that you took in live at Charlestown. That was, of course, Charlestown Classic Night, that Grade 2 event that's now been won for the second year in a row by Art Collector, and probably not as deep a field as they assembled for the Charlestown Classic that Art Collector won last year. And just to my eye, Craig, watching the early part of this race, it was quite apparent as they were heading out of the backstretch the first time that nobody was really looking to apply that much pressure, and it seemed like a lot of jocks were just riding for second in this race.
I was really surprised by that because Norm Cash had 2 horses in here, and one of them, Jalen Journey, is a pure sprinter who has done nothing but sprint in his career. I thought maybe he was in the race to be the rabbit, but that just never happens in racing these days, I guess. We like to think it's going to happen, but it rarely plays out that way. Our collector was allowed to just loop on the front end, and I say that we have all the fractions in blue. The early pace figures were just 102s. So for a horse like him, when you let him get away with that and give him a head start, the race was basically over. He was able to just pull away, win by over 4 lengths. Ran a 118 speed figure, which is exactly what he ran in his comeback race. Probably held back a little by pace. We knocked it down from a 120 final time, but Art Collector, that's what he is. They got a little ambitious with him last year. He ran in the Classic. I believe they shipped him overseas, if I'm not mistaken, but he didn't run or so. I forget exactly what happened with him.
Yeah, the Saudi Cup.
Right. He didn't get to run there, but this is where he belongs. He's more a grade 2, grade 3 type. I know he won a grade 1 last year, but it was a pretty watered down one. And he just shows up and gives a solid effort every time. Hats off to Mudaib, I believe is how they pronounce it, the Charlestown runner. He had come in as a 10 for 10, a perfect record. He had actually won a race on Charlestown Classic night last year, a different race, obviously. But he stepped up and ran a big race of 115. And I do think we need to mention Mind Control, who ran really gamely in defeat. I don't know if he would have won or not, but he certainly would have been at least second. He had just broke really slow, was behind the field, and that made all the difference. His win chances were over at the break.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an odd spot for Mind Control in the first place, trying to stretch out to a mile and eighth. That's never really been his gig, but you're right. He did not get the right kind of trip, especially given the pace scenario with Art Collector just kind of dictating terms on the front end. Art Collector, I think, did run in the Saudi Cup, though I believe his connections and those backers of him probably want to forget that performance. It didn't do much there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he's really as good as he was last year. It's kind of hard to tell off his two races. He's just kind of been handed these easy leads, and he's done what he's been expected to do. I don't really view him as a top handicap horse, so we'll see where they decide to go from here. But I'd imagine he's going to struggle a little bit when he steps up against some tougher company and a little bit more of a pace pressure in the early going. Yeah, cool run by that West Virginia bred. I think the announcer called him Wadib, who was second here. Just looked like a horse that was trying so hard. He had won all of his races. He was really making an effort to go with Art Collector on the far turn, just didn't really have the natural ability to do so, but was game to hold on for second. But like you were saying, Craig, I mean, just not a whole lot of drama to the running of this race. Let's talk about some of the other notable performances from Friday night at Charlestown, most of which took place in 7 furlong stakes events on the undercard. One of those was the Grade 3 Charlestown Oaks, won by the 3-year-old filly Society for Steve Asmussen. And another race that didn't feature that much pace, but boy, did this 3-year-old filly really motor home and earned quite a speed figure for a sophomore filly.
Yeah, she took a step forward from other races for sure. And I do want to point out, even though the two races we talked about so far, the Classic and the Oaks, went wire to wire, both were more the product of the pace, I think. It wasn't a Charlestown Classic card racetrack like we saw last year, where virtually every race was won on the inside or wire to wire and just seemed like a really biased track. This was one where horses were able to win from the outside, come from behind a couple times. You're not going to see that a lot at Charlestown, no matter what, because of the size of the track. But I do think it was a really fair track, much so more than last year. So I thought it was a big effort by Society. She ran a 121 speed figure in here. It was a 125 final time, knocked down a little by pace. And when you look through the chart, it's not really a surprise because the other horses have all basically ran the speed figures they've been running coming in. And she just took a step forward to my eye.
Yeah, she's a talented horse. I remember kind of assessing her when she ran in the Coaching Club American Oaks in her prior start and really liking the visual of her races, but just kind of feeling like the Coaching Club was probably the wrong spot for her. And it really turned out to be the wrong spot when she completely botched the start, stumbling badly and then rushed up. I mean, she was never beating Nest anyway, and certainly wasn't beating Nest and Secret Oath with that kind of trip. But it worked out much better for her on the cutback, and she probably is one that's more of a 7 furlong to a mile type of runner. And just another really talented progeny of gun runner. I mean, he is having quite a year, or quite a couple of years with his first 2 crops, and Society just another in a long line of stakes winners for him. Let's briefly mention a couple of the other notable performances from that Charlestown Classic night, Craig. The Pink Ribbon Stakes for the fillies, the older fillies and mares, was won by Frank's Rocket. An even slower early pace than the one that we saw Society set, but she really came home quickly and I believe earned the highest raw final time number of anybody on this card from a speed figure standpoint, at least going the 7 furlong distance. She's a really nice filly, just didn't have a whole lot of competition in this race.
She was actually a little bit behind Society, who had a 125 final time. Frank's Rocket was a 123. But as you said, the pace was really slow. Her speed figure got knocked all the way down to a 112. And that's one of those, if you look at the horses in behind, you can see why. They all kind of basically ran the figures they've been running. As for Frank's Rocket, I would say she's closer to that 123 horse right now. We saw her big effort last time when she wasn't able to quite hold off Kamari, a horse who beat her by a half length after Frank's Rocket had some real trouble at the start of that race, rushed up. But I thought Frank's Rocket made a big breakthrough that day when she ran that big 124 speed figure in defeat. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more from her going forward. I'm not sure what's happened, but I think the lights went on with her.
Yeah, I was a little surprised to see her show up here rather than in the Ballerina, where Bill Mott did run three other fillies, some with lesser accomplishments than Frank's Rocket. I know that Frank's Rocket is a horse that they've run outside of New York a lot. I don't know what exactly is the reason for that, but you're right. She's been in great form. It feels like she's really stepped up her game in her last few starts, and I don't want to say that she's out of the conversation for the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint this year. I mean, she's been earning numbers that put her in the conversation with a horse like Goodnight Olive. She just has not always been the most reliable win candidate, as I know that you've exploited in the past.
Yeah, she was a horse I even talked about last time. She always seems to find a way to lose the races that you think she's going to win. But even in defeat last time, I just she looked like a different horse to me. She really fought. And I was really impressed with her again. Maybe I'm overstating things. It wasn't the strongest field, obviously, here at Charlestown, but it was a $250,000 race, and she looked really good to me. So I would expect her back in graded stakes right away.
Yeah, she came home her last eighth in 12.35. And if you know Charlestown, you see a lot of 13 plus final eighths of a mile going the 7 furlong distance. Typically, races are not run in the fashion where horses are sprinting to the wire, coming off that tight turn. And she was really just flying through the finish line, something you don't often see at that track. So do want to give her some credit there, despite the fact that that speed figure did get knocked down a little bit for the slow pace. And Craig, we should mention the winner of the Russell Road a little bit later in the card, Sir Alfred James, who in August was making the 14th start of his career and is still delivering performances like this.
Yeah, 14th start of the year. And
I'm sorry, 14th start of the year, correct.
And I'm actually a big fan of his because of how often he runs. And I went back and did the math. This was actually his 20th start within a calendar year. And he just has to be a warrior because not only has he run 20 times, he's been thrown in over his head, to be honest, quite a few times, and it doesn't seem to phase him. When he gets in the right class, he always seems to run his race. He won a nice allowance at Delaware, and he was able to win this one as well. He beat a pretty good sprinter and Wonder Where Craig is, who I think we saw win at Saratoga last year. It's not like these were just a bunch of local horses. That one was actually 2-5 in here. Really didn't have an excuse, but Sir Alfred Dreams just keeps running, running and running. I'm sure he'll run a few more times this year. Hats off to trainer Norman Cash, who I mentioned earlier. I don't know much about him, but I know he runs his horses, so he's okay by me.
Yeah, it seems like a trainer that's not always so concerned about win percentage. Just kind of, wants to have a horse in action every couple of weeks or so, and a lot of them don't respond well to it. But Sir Alfred James is one that has kind of just rolled with the punches and keeps showing up. I think they claimed him for $62,500 from Al Stall back in September at Churchill of last year, so less than a year ago. And like you said, he's run 20 times, and I think he's earned close to $500,000 since then. Just kind of crazy that they've had so much success with this $62,500 claim in such a short amount of time. But he's just a cool horse like that. And for people that don't know, Sir Alfred James is the younger half brother to Got Stormy, that two-time 4-star Dave winner. So just a really cool family that he's just this awesome dirt sprinter, and she was so good on the turf. Just a really neat horse.
Yeah, Norman Cash has that other horse, Beverly Park, who's more of a starter allowance type, but that one has actually started 22 times this year and has won 10 races, racked up some money, and I believe he won one over the well at this weekend at Timonium when I was there in Maryland. I was watching before I went to Charlestown that day. So, yeah, I wish we had more guys like Norman Cash. At least I'm hoping he doesn't just do that with every horse. I don't know enough about him, but he's obviously found a few horses that can stand up to it and are thriving under such work.
Well, we've already covered a lot of racing at some of the bigger meets like Saratoga and Del Mar. We're going to talk about a few more other venues before we close out this podcast. At Parks early in the week, they ran a couple of stakes for 3-year-olds, the Smarty Jones and the Catherine Sophia. We should mention both of them, Craig. Best Actor, the winner of the Smarty Jones, a horse that was coming out of a second place finish in, I believe it was the Indiana Derby. I always get these
I
confused. I
believe
think
you're
he ran
correct.
the Indiana Derby. And I feel like the Smarty Jones, part of the margin of victory was just a function of the fact that some others didn't show up with their best races here. But he's definitely one that's moving forward for Brad Cox.
He is. He got a nice 117 speed figure. I wish I did, but I don't remember the specifics. I know I split this race from the other one we're going to talk about on the card, the Catherine Sophia. Reading them together was just impossible. There was no way it made any sense. They timed okay, so obviously something changed with the track, but I thought he ran fine in here. He's a horse who shows good speed earlier. Gets good tactical position, and as you said, some others didn't show up. Namely, Creative Minister, who was third in the Preakness, which seems like it was about 8 years ago, based on how he's run since. He really hasn't run very well at all, and he's one I would say seems like he needs a rest.
I would agree with that. He has just not gone on since running, not in every leg of the Triple Crown, but running on the days of the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont this year. That was a big ask for him back then. And Craig, we should also talk about the Catherine Sophia run on the same day at Parks. The race that you were talking about was kind of tough to group with the Smarty Jones, just given the respective times. I think they were run at two slightly different distances. I think the Catherine Sophia was 1 mile and 70 yards, and the Smarty Jones was 1 mile and 1/16. But anyway you slice it, the Catherine Sophia and Greenup, the winner of this race, just ran a really fast race. And, it feels like she's kind of been a little bit of a secret for the Todd Pletcher barn, running in some lower level spots in the Mid-Atlantic region at Monmouth, but now again here at Parks. But she's really moving forward and is kind of heading towards maybe being a contender in the Grade 1 Cotillion.
Yeah, she ran a 120 speed figure here, and even though I had to break the races apart, I'm pretty confident in that speed figure looking at the rest of the field, unless you think everybody else just didn't show up. And this was actually the race that was fast time-wise. I mean, if I didn't break it out, if I had rated those two together, this one would have been through the roof, whereas the Smarty Jones would have been incredibly low. So, like I said, it was impossible. But I think Interstate Daydream ran a race, ran the same speed figure she's been running. She just wasn't able to hold up Greenup, who took a huge step forward speed figure wise. She had obviously won 3 in a row coming in, but this was something else altogether, and she looked good doing it. The visual matches the number, so I will be interested to see where she shows up, because she certainly fits with a lot of fillies that we've seen so far this year outside of Nest.
Yeah, I just loved the visual of her finishing this race. She was really motoring down the center of the track and putting some distance between her and Interstate Daydream across the wire. So feels like one that's really moving forward very quickly, and we'll see where they decide to go next. But it does feel like she's earned her way into a much tougher race next time out. Sticking with the theme of Todd Pletcher runners, let's talk about the stakes from Monmouth Park last week for the 2-year-olds. The Sapling going 1 mile. A lot of runners stretching out in this race that hadn't tried the 2 turns before, Craig, and one that really seemed to relish it was Lost Ark, the winner here. He, of course, is the younger half-brother to Nest, as well as Idol, that Santa Anita handicap winner, and was bred to go longer and clearly relished the extra ground.
He was a horse who looked really good at Belmont when he broke his maiden. He only ran a 94 speed figure. I say only, that's fine for a 2-year-old, but especially when you consider that one came in early July, just before the move to Saratoga. I liked what I saw from him, and as you said, no problem stretching out the 2 turns, as he was able to run a 101 speed figure, did it easily, won by a bunch of lengths again. So this is a horse with a lot of promise, and again, I wouldn't compare that speed figure too much to the sprints we've seen so far, with it being so early. We're going to see more and more of these 2-turn races coming up, but like the one at Del Mar, this is one of the first we've seen, and the 2-year-olds generally take a little bit longer to get their speed figures up going that second turn.
Yeah, the one thing about Lost Ark is when you watch him run, he just has the ugliest action. I mean, he's got this big high-stepping stride and this awful, paddle to his stride. Go watch the head-on of the Sapling, and you'll see what I mean. It's really the kind of thing that you wonder if sustainable for a horse like this to have that such poor mechanics and run so fast. So we'll see how that works out for him. But you don't often see horses with that kind of inefficient action have as much success as he does. So we'll see how Lost Ark develops. But he's definitely one, even though he's by Violence and Nest and Idol are by Curlin, that damn Marion Ravenwood, whose foals have those Raiders of the Lost Ark themed names. They've been so talented, and he's definitely taken after that dam. Let's mention one more 2-year-old stakes and one more race on this podcast from the last week, Craig, as we head out to Prairie Meadows and once again discuss Tyler's Tribe, a horse that we've highlighted on this podcast before. And I kind of posed the question on Twitter this past week, is this the best 2-year-old in the country? Not really serious. I'm not saying that I think that, but he definitely has earned the best speed figure of any 2-year-old in the country, which he accomplished last week in the Prairie Meadows Freshman.
Yeah, I want to tip our cap a little bit because we've been talking about Tyler's Tribe long before other people were, because he's been running fast all along. And once again, he took another huge step forward. I think this was his biggest margin as he won by about 15 lengths. And he ran a huge 120 speed figure, which is, I mean, it's almost off the charts for a 2-year-old. Now, granted, it's a sprint. It's not against a lot of competition. It's unfortunate to me that there's not really a race for him in the Breeders' Cup. Who knows if he'll take turf. They tried the juvenile sprint, I think, for a year or two. Didn't really work out. But he's definitely one that needs to step up in competition. He's a horse who shouldn't be running for. He should be running for more than 100,000. Give the horse a chance and let's see what he has. But he's certainly one of the more exciting 2-year-olds we've seen in a while outside of the major circuits.
Yeah, and I mean, I know some people were saying, oh, it's a matter of time before he's sold, or it's a bad sign that he hasn't, been purchased by better connections yet. And you have to understand there's a whole story around this horse. I'm not going to recite it all now, but you can go read some of the great reporting. I know Jason Beam was highlighting this on his podcast. Our colleague Mary Rampolini has written some stories in the Daily Racing Form about Tyler's Tribe. He's got a very meaningful name. He's a gelding, so I mean, obviously he's not going to be a horse that the top connections are really, seeking to be a stallion. That's just not an option for him. So typically those are the kinds of horses that get bought, those that are not gelded already. But he is really fast. He's eligible for these state bred races, so they're taking advantage of them while they can. They've mentioned maybe trying one of the Breeders' Cup turf races, like the turf sprint or the juvenile turf. They don't really think he's a 2-turn dirt horse for the juvenile. So I don't know if those are going to be the right spots for him, Craig. Like you said, there really isn't the right race at the Breeders' Cup for him. But he is really fast, and it's going to be exciting to see what he ultimately does when they try tougher competition.
Yeah, I mean, 4 races, he's won by over 50 lengths now, and this was the first time he really showed his early speed. He ran a 131 pace figure. In his other races, he had gone kind of slow because he opened up and there was just no reason to go fast, but he actually faced a little pressure early from a horse named Dixie Magic, who was pretty quick himself, had run a nice debut with an 82 speed figure, which is pretty solid for a 2-year-old, especially in Prairie Meadows, and he just shook him off like he wasn't even in the race. So not sure what the plans are, but I know I'll be watching.
Yeah, very exciting horse. And it is that time of year where we see some talented 2-year-olds come out of the woodwork as we look ahead to the rest of the season. Craig, one more week of Saratoga ahead of us. Also coming up this weekend at Del Mar, we have that much anticipated Pacific Classic, which is supposed to feature Flightline trying the 1.25 mile distance for the first time. I'll see how my workload is looking, Craig. We might try to handicap that Del Mar card. I think that would be an appropriate thing to do with Flightline running. So maybe we'll make that the focus on the forecast this week.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. It will be interesting. I don't believe the Pacific Classic has been run this late before. Unfortunately, I guess they're catering to the new trend of training up to the Breeders' Cup for now, starts in the end of August to the beginning of September. Not sure that bodes well for the game, but it is what it is. A little disappointing, but I imagine the horses we see in the Pacific Classic, for the most part, that'll be it till the Breeders' Cup, at least Flightline. But it will be interesting to see what he does, if he can handle the distance. He's certainly been brilliant. He's going to face some pretty formidable foes. And Royal Ship, I believe, is in there. Country Grammar is another one. So it's not going to be a cakewalk. He's not going to be one of those that can get the 1.25 mile just because he's way faster than everybody else, even if he's tired at the end. He's going to have to work.
Yeah, that's going to be a really exciting race to handicap and to watch. There are other stakes that are also planned for that Saturday car at Del Mar, so we'll take a look at that and see how it comes up if there's an interesting sequence to talk about. So something to look forward to on the podcast later this week. Craig, great to have you back on the podcast, of course, and we'll be back for another one this Friday. Everybody remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and as I said, make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.